My name is Ryan New. I'm the instructional lead at Jefferson County Public Schools. Today we're going to be looking at the question, how do I read the JCPS curriculum framework? We've been discussing the idea of inquiry, beginning with questions, investigating different disciplines, using evidence, and ultimately creating argument and action. The very first step of any framing, whether it be for the year, for a unit, or a lesson, begins with questions. So what is the process for framing with questions? Well, questions are more relevant than answers. Questions are bigger than answers. One good question can give rise to several answers, several layers of answers, can inspire decades-long searches for solutions, can generate whole new fields of inquiry, and can prompt changes in entrenched thinking. Answers, on the other hand, often end the process. As I tell my own children, questions have the ability to create and destroy, and we have to know when and how to use them. When it comes to looking at a framework, framing a curriculum around large, unanswerable questions, in the sense that there are no right or wrong answers, only answers that need to be defended with evidence, allows students to become part of a continuous civic conversation. History was not a finished story to be memorized, but a set of ongoing questions for collective engagement. This is essentially at the heart of what history is all about policies are all about, and that if we're looking at the same types of questions and problems that people of the past had, oftentimes they're reflected in the present. We've seen before about how do I scaffold a year. We're saying that questions, sources, and tasks give a good foundation for the year, for the unit, and the lesson in order to better prepare and scaffold students towards creating better arguments and more informed action. For our breakdown of how we designed the curriculum framework, we'll look at how the year is, the unit, and the lesson. For the year, really from 5th to 11th grade, we included 10 units, each with their own compelling question. For each year, for each grade, there's around 120 lessons, which include 10 staging of the compelling question, really getting to know that question, 90 supporting questions total, which means about 9 supporting questions for each unit, and 10 opportunities to inform some type of argument. This then provides around 40 additional days, opportunities for extended inquiry that might have teachers and students co-constructing more focused lessons and their inquiry to dive deeper into some units than others, or excellent opportunities to take informed action. When we're looking at kindergarten through 4th grade, there are still many units, just not the standard 10. For 3rd and 4th, we have 9. For 2nd, we have 8. For 1st, we have 7. And for kindergarten, we have 6 units. Each unit has typically 1 day for staging the compelling question. Again, making space so that students can feel that the question that has been going on, right, both in a historical and contemporary sense, is something that they too have experienced and have questions about. Staging the compelling question was always one of my students' favorite days. Then we'll be investigating through those disciplinary standards, supporting question, the 9 supporting question lessons. Each unit then ends with some type of argument, whether it be written, verbal, or multimodal. And finally, depending on how you're framing and focusing the year, there's opportunities to take informed action. Each lesson has a supporting question, has 2 to 7 primary and secondary sources depending on your level and what you're trying to accomplish in that supporting question, and organizational, discussion, and argumentative tasks. Remember that the ultimate goal is to create good arguments and to take informed action. This is how we've backwards planned our curriculum frameworks. What are the necessary skills, dispositions, and knowledge that's necessary to create an enriched experience dealing with argument and action? Our curricular frameworks then move students towards the development of deeper learning through the backpack skills of success. Here you can see that when students are composing arguments that are taking multiple days, or action that results from arguments made, they are really embodying the 5 indicators of the backpack that are really about social studies, about how we learn to live together, and how we need to view and think about the world, ourselves, and each other. Once again, our frameworks are built upon the idea that we are scaffolding inquiry for our students. Every unit has a design like this. There's just more supporting questions. The ultimate goal is a compelling question, of which is bookended by an argument and the summative performance task. We figure out what supporting questions help ramp students up to the compelling question, while we're also thinking about the types of skills we want them to have in the formative performance tasks. Organizational tasks help students create those formative performance tasks as those organizational tasks bring together sources, discussions, and questions. If the argument is to be written, then students should have ample opportunities to practice that writing to be more successful in that argument. If students are speaking their arguments, they need to have ample opportunity to be able to speak in class, to clarify and to get used and to have the stamina and the confidence to be able to have those verbal arguments. And ultimately, once students have done that, they're more informed to take action. Here we see the larger picture, which is using compelling questions to frame the curriculum frameworks. Our example here will be 8th grade. You can see very quickly that we have those 10 units. Each of them are based upon a certain 9 weeks. These are just a suggestion because oftentimes teachers will ask, how long should these take? That's ultimately up to you in your classroom. What we want to say is that when asked how long it should take, we're giving an opportunity here to say a real balanced approach is about 5 units prior to Christmas break and 5 units after. Every single one of our frameworks will eventually have this larger idea, which is again, backwards planning, just like we would with the argument and action about what's going on in the backpack skills of success, right? This is ultimately tying everything together, right? So that each unit is really looking at combining dispositions with inquiry as a process to produce better arguments and action. Here we see then, on the actual frameworks themselves, a breakdown of the compelling questions, each of them linked to the unit below. You'll note as well that oftentimes we try to sequence our compelling questions in a way that we think makes a lot of sense. In this one example, and it's not true for all, but in this one example, you can see that students are beginning the year looking at was colonial America democratic society? And then they're ending the year also talking about democratic societies after the Civil War and Reconstruction. That kind of bookend allows for a lot of conversation for students to be able to pull through all those experiences so that each unit, they're building a larger understanding of not only the compelling question for that unit, but the compelling questions that lie ahead. At the beginning of each of the frameworks, after the compelling questions, we are able to give teachers and students, if they so choose, in the community, a layout of all the supporting questions and compelling questions in one area. That means that you're going to have 10 compelling questions and around 100 supporting questions of which to look at. This way you're able to sort of see in one clear place the entire scope of the questions that not only do we create, but our teachers who created them with us. Finally, as you move down into each unit, eventually every single unit will have an overview that sort of pulls together a lot of the different understandings that are happening inside of that unit. We're sequencing the types of supporting questions. We're talking about what arguments and actions might take place in that unit, as well as some of the instructional supports that you might use and some of the extra resources from C3 teachers or Stanford Historical Education Group or the Smithsonian's might provide. And we're also providing specific factual information that we're aligning along with questions and the standards. Under each unit as well, we've bookended just as they appear in the standards. We have questioning at the very top. We have the disciplines in between. We have using evidence and communicating conclusions. While it's true that we're pulling together specific disciplinary standards for each unit, we're remaining those same exact inquiry standards for every single unit because we don't know the types of skills that you're going to use with your students as you're scaffolding their learning. What I will say is that it was our task, and we achieved this task, that every single unit that we have includes at least one of the disciplinary standards. This is a close-up of sort of the bundling of those disciplinary standards inside of units. It's true that if you see some of the other ones and you want to include it in a certain unit, by all means do so. Something to point out here is that as we've got these bundled out, you might want to look at the language as you're deconstructing these standards for that unit. What language are you going to use to ensure that A, students are using that academic vocabulary to understand that concept, being able to use that concept in their investigation of sources and the creation of arguments, but it's also preparing them for the state assessment. So for example, if we were to look at allocation of resources and economic incentives, that might be something that you're going to definitely want to note and include. If you're looking at constitutional provisions, laws, and court rulings, these are terminology that are super important. They can appear in any context on the state assessment, but it's really getting the students used to hearing terms like voting rights, diverse groups, sectional and national tensions, or physical geography and location. This is the language of our discipline, and we need to ensure that students know that language. When it comes to the framework itself, underneath, this is how we're starting to pull together and sequence the questions and standards. Instead of having targets, we've mentioned before that we have supporting questions. Those supporting questions build and scaffold students to the compelling question. Here we have an example: how did racist policies divide the country? Looking at the buildup to the Civil War. We have sequenced in supporting questions. Here you only see a few, but those are then aligned to the disciplinary standards, and we've also aligned them to the possible specific factual information that might help you either find sources or to talk about how these things existed in the context of the 1850s. What we've done is devised a plan where two disciplinary standards help shape and sharpen the others, so that by the combination of those two standards, we're able to get at much more robust and significant questions to investigate. How does the sequence of questions determine the scope of investigation? Oftentimes, at the very beginning of the unit, the questions are much larger. That was intentional. It's to help lay a foundation, because we're going to be returning to those ideas throughout the entire unit. So you're slowly layering in the foundation day after day as you are scaffolding up those questions and backwards planning the skills to help students towards that argument and action. By the end of the unit, or even maybe in the middle of the unit, there are much more specific or narrowed examples, including case studies, that allow you to really dive into a very specific element. Social studies teachers have always had to battle depth and breadth, right? Well, breadth is no longer really of an issue, so long as we understand the language of the standards. We're able to really dive into some of the individual instances and give kids a much more robust understanding of the history from which many of the issues that we talk about today arise. How does language determine the size of a supporting question? Sometimes teachers will see the size of a supporting question and think, it's going to take me forever to be able to do this. Not necessarily the case. What we recommend is that a question like you might see here, under a compelling question like how does belief influence action? Well, here's a macro, a very large supporting question. How did reformers attempt to change society? You might say, well, I could spend an entire unit on that. Let's say, though, that you spend a 45-minute class period on this. Imagine then the sources that you might have. If we're looking at the 1830s and 40s and the moral reforms that are trying to take place in the United States during that time, you might have a source from an abolitionist, a source from a women's rights activist, another source from a transcendentalist, right? And the idea here is that you're showing that there are just multiple people, because throughout that unit, You might be returning to some of those groups and dig more deeply into what's going on, but those first few supporting questions provide a greater context for the background that students are going to be experiencing as they move through. When it comes to a more medium question, right, we might take from how did reformers attempt to change society to how did women reformers change authority, right, or challenge authority. So now you're talking more specifically about that change, and you're talking more specifically about who the women might be. But there's a lot of different women and a lot of different ways that they're challenging authority at the time. A micro or even a case study approach might be how did Lucretia Mott challenge authority? Now that's really going to sharp and shapen how you're viewing the standards, but also the sources in which you would then use in your investigation. Again, we're trying to build up this larger idea of moving from questions through the disciplines, using evidence to build argument and action. Our curriculum frameworks are ongoing. We need your help. These will be living documents because it takes some time, typically around 3 to 5 years, to develop a more robust curriculum. So this has been a session about how do I read the JCPS curriculum framework. Thank you.